Hey, everybody, we're live in the interwebs. Thank you for joining us tonight for this special screening on a Friday night.
Thanks, Giorgio, for welcoming everybody. My name is Brianna Contreras. I'm an intellectual property attorney here in Santa Fe, New Mexico at Barkey Allison. I'm also on the board of the intellectual property law section for the State Bar of New Mexico. We worked in collaboration with the New Mexico Museum of the Arts and the Center for Contemporary Art, although I have to say the filmmakers and they did the vast majority of the work to make this event possible. And so we thank them. We thank Mr. Tompros for being here tonight. I wanted to tell you a little bit before we begin the panel discussion about the intellectual property law section of the State Bar. We annually host a pro bono IP fair for artists and inventors in the community who want some free legal advice. So if you want to learn more about that, if you have ideas and you don't know how to protect them, check out the State Bar of New Mexico's website and go to the intellectual property law section and you'll be able to get in touch with us. There's also widely attended events, including continuing legal education events with inventors, brewers, and people in the creative fields that kind of combine interests in different businesses and intellectual property areas. I have the distinct pleasure tonight of introducing the moderator of tonight's panel discussion. Jacqueline Frank is an award-winning producer for movies and television and member of the Directors Guild of America and on the board of directors for the Center of Contemporary Art. She's going to be leading the discussion this evening, and so I'll turn it over to you, Jackie.
Thank you, Brianna, and thank you for letting our audience know about the pro bono legal advice that's available here. New Mexico is a state full of artists. I'm sure they appreciate knowing about that. I'd like to thank the New Mexico Museum of Art for collaborating with us, along with the Bar Association. So joining us this evening, to our delight, is Giorgio Angelini, who is the co-director and producer of Feels Good Man, Arthur Jones, the director of Feels Good Man, and Louis Tompros, who was a lawyer who's been helping Matt on all these issues. So, and of course, we'll be seeing your questions coming in. We'll be doing our best to answer questions as we can. I guess top of the line for me, actually, I want to know, Giorgio and Arthur, what was the response on 4chan to this film?
Well, I mean, I spent a lot of time on 4chan before making the film, and I was very happy to not go back to it after the film was released. So I closed the laptop on 4chan as we were completing the film. Occasionally, someone will send me something. The response on 4chan has been predictable. I mean, I've been called a number of terrible things when we released a Meet the Artists trailer for Sundance. And I was called a cringy homo by 4chan in a pretty long thread. But outside of that, it's been fine. I mean, that was predictable. But for the most part, the response to the film has been great. And we've gotten a lot of emails from people who maybe spent their teens on 4chan and have kind of grown out of that. And the movie spoke to them in a pretty specific way. And those emails have been very nice, actually.
Great. And Giorgio, have you had any trolling, flaming, doxing?
I was operating our social media up until very recently. So in the initial period, especially when we released the first trailer, which was really, we had kept the project pretty private for obvious reasons. And so the trailer was really the first time that most people knew that the film existed. And, at that point, we got a lot of not understandably, well, I guess understandably. Predictably, grotesque comments on YouTube. But, you're ranging the basic position being like, oh, a bunch of normie filmmakers are coming in to make this film they don't know anything about, and they think it's a Nazi symbol. How dumb are they? This is ridiculous. It's going to be so bad. And then the film came out, and I don't know if it's a one-to-one correlation, but certainly like Arthur was saying, a lot of people from that community, either directly to us or what we gleaned from reading social media, were like, oh, actually the film's pretty good. They got it right. And I have to say, not that we were seeking their approval, but we were actively trying to make a film that didn't talk down to this community or didn't treat it with kid gloves, but with honesty. And so, you know, that is somewhat, I wouldn't say rewarding, but I guess useful, maybe.
Well, it's such a wonderful film and it's so eye-opening. And I think you really did accomplish that. And you treated everybody in it with tremendous respect, which, you know, in my humble opinion, they didn't all deserve, but you certainly treated them that way. So Arthur, what was the genesis of this film? How did this all get started?
I mean, the genesis of the film was, I mean, probably the first time I bought a Boys Club comic, probably around 2010 or something, at an independent bookstore. That was before I knew Matt Fury, but I thought the comics, you know, when I bought them were funny and unique, and they kind of spoke to like these childhood memories I had of like the Muppets and the Never-Ending Story. Like there's kind of a built-in nostalgia with Matt's comics. And I'm a cartoonist. That's what I did before making Feels Good Man. And so I moved to California and I met Matt Fury through friends. We met on like a long hike to a hot springs. We camped, and then the next day we hiked back, and we had like a really amazing conversation about all sorts of things. And we just had a lot in common. You know, in 2015, there was this very strange moment where Pepe was supposedly used or reportedly used by a school shooter. It's in the film, but the school shooter had used an image of Pepe holding a gun. And then 2 weeks after that, then presidential candidate Donald Trump retweeted an image of himself as Pepe, as Smug Pepe. And those two stories were reported separately, but there was something that I was like, why aren't the connections being made between these two incidences? You know, I felt like the zeitgeist was kind of on fire or something. I was like, what does this have to do with my friend's cartoon? What is going on? And so that was kind of the impetus for this story. And Giorgio and I were working on a film that he was making called Owned, A Tale of Two Americas. And he knew Pepe from Reddit. And we just kind of folded that collaboration into this film.
So was that kind of when you started, was in 2015, or when did you actually start filming?
Well, we had conceived of the idea early 2017, and I started researching 4chan. I spent a number of months on 4chan, just researching it, talking to people, emailing with people. We started making it in 2017, and I think the thing that really kind of forced our hand or made us commit to like, all right, we're doing this, was the Charlottesville Unite the Right rally. I think for a number of people who were involved in making the film, that was a really galvanizing moment. You know, we started shooting the film in November 2017, and that was just a couple months after that incident. So we were really, we understood that the story of Pepe was this really unique case study into how trolling moved off of message boards and into mainstream politics. And even though it was this funny story about a stone cartoon frog and the creator behind it, it was also this story really about the cultural moment we're all sitting in. And so, yeah, that's when we started, 2017.
And so at that point, Matt was on board, or was he a little, because he seems so shy, you know, he seems like someone who wouldn't be that keen to be featured, but things were already accelerating so much with Pepe that he's understood what you were after and was on board?
What started with Arthur?
Yeah, it was a process.
You guys were like pitching something, right? Like it kind of started initially as a different project entirely.
Well, I mean, a lot of it actually started with Chris, who's featured in the film, who has the tattoo on his arm. And Chris and Matt are best friends. And, you know, Chris was working at a pizza parlor, and Matt and I went into the pizza parlor with Ursula and my niece, who's the same age as Ursula. And Chris told us the story about how someone had come into the pizza parlor he was working at and accused him of being a neo-Nazi because he had a Pepe tattoo and had thrown a tantrum. And that was that incident and that conversation that Matt and I had after talking to Chris. Matt just kind of asked me for help. He was just like, I don't know what to do about this stuff. And so we initially pitched a cartoon that was going to be like, I mean, you know, we live in LA, I'm a cartoonist. Like, we pitched this idea for a cartoon that was going to be kind of an Alice in Wonderland style story of Pepe getting pulled out of his home and then basically getting, you know, into the rabbit hole with this vortex of trolls and things. And we very quickly realized that Pepe had this toxic baggage to it, and no one really could see our vision for it because it was so obscured by Pepe being a hate symbol. And so that's how it started. And then I pitched him on the idea of like, oh, let's try to make a documentary. And maybe Matt was a little bit reluctant, but Ayana really felt passionately about it. She was like, this is a crazy thing that's happening to us. We should document this because it's so unique, and let's document it with friends. And so that was the impetus for all of it.
So it was essentially a 2-year journey, basically, of tracking what was going on. And what it was,
2.5 years.
2018 or 19 that he came to you, Louis?
It was actually, no, it was around the same time, 2017, I think, around the same time that the work that Arthur was doing really began. It was interesting because your description, Arthur, I hadn't heard you say that before, but your description of Matt being sort of somewhat reluctant and Ayana pushing him to go do this is very similar to the legal work that we did, right? That Matt was reluctant to sort of take action, and it was really his wife Ayana who said, let's go talk to lawyers and figure out what you can actually do and what you can't. In fact, my first phone call was with her, not with Matt, to talk through the whole set of issues.
That makes sense, right? Because it's like no one has really been through what Matt has gone through, or at least not gone to the extent to like that he has gone through to actually like kind of solve it.
It's really heartrending. Was it the character Mills, the 4chan guy? Was it hard to find him, someone who was willing to kind of participate in this normie thing? Because of course I found it sort of ironic that, you know, it's sort of turning the whole 4chan thing on its head. You know, we hate you, but yeah, you want to shine a spotlight on us? That's fine.
Well, you're right, Jacqueline. Yeah, it's something where people on 4chan want to be anonymous for a reason. And so when you choose to make yourself no longer anonymous on 4chan, it's like you're breaking omerta. And so Mills had already been kind of trolled within the 4chan community. So I think he kind of felt like maybe he had like stepped away from it slightly at the time that we filmed him. He also had a YouTube channel that had like some stuff on it. And then on 4chan, he's a meme within 4chan. Like you see his face on 4chan because he's kind of like emblematic of the 4chan user on some boards within 4chan. So it was a negotiation to get him to talk to us, but ultimately I think he was excited to talk to us because he felt like he knew more about 4chan than anyone else, and he wanted to tell the world.
And it's at the end of the day, it is an attention economy, right? Like despite being anonymous on 4chan, it triggers these same impulses that Instagram does. It's just constructed a little bit differently, but like it's still about creating content that meets the needs of the general audience in the best possible way in order to like drive engagement. And on Instagram, it's about like whatever, being on a yacht or like promoting your new vodka brand or whatever. And then on 4chan, it's just saying the most, well, I will be fair to 4chan, in certain boards, it's about being like the most depraved, right? That the way the system is designed, it's like it's Darwinian in that sense.
But on the origami board, it's just about who makes the best paper crane.
Exactly. Yeah.
I don't know.
So, I mean, you know, as I was watching the film and when I watched it again, I still don't understand, and this, I'm directing this a little bit at Louis. Don't we have any kind of hate speech laws in this country and incitement? I mean, is none of this sort of against the law that goes on there?
I mean, that's a great question. So we do, but then we also have very strong First Amendment protections and for really good reasons. And so all of these things really become a balance, right? We don't want to be in general and in the business of telling people what they can and can't say. What everything is really the basic principle is you should be able to say whatever you want to say, and everything else is a limitation on that. So of course there are limitations on things that that endanger people, right? You cannot stand up and call for people to go attack others, right? That's not okay, as we know. You cannot, and then there are other limits in the intellectual property space, right? You can't take something that belongs to somebody else and claim it as your own, particularly not if you're trying to make money off of it. But even if you're not, so I think I actually, it's interesting because when I did talk to Matt about what his legal remedies are, it turns out that as awful as the stuff that was being done with Pepe was, it wasn't the awfulness of it that really gave him rights. It was that they had taken his thing. And if someone is taking your own artwork and doing something terrible with it, you do have rights, not because they're doing something terrible, but because they've taken something that's yours. And artists do have the ability to control that to a degree within our legal structure.
There's a lot of questions coming in here from the audience, all I think heading in Lewis's direction. One is from Peter I. He wants to know whether the litigation was all based on copyright violations or were other legal theories used?
Yeah. So
the second question was a copyright filed for Pepe and what types of damages were claimed?
Great questions. Both questions are fantastic. So the answer is that the bulk of the work that we have done enforcing Matt's rights in Pepe have been related to copyright specifically. And that it's one of these things that's really particularly applicable to works like a character and works like a visual piece of art like a comic. And so my number one piece of advice to artists is almost always make sure you understand what your rights are, right? Go to one of these pro bono days like Brianna was talking about it and listen to lawyers are boring, but like listen to us for like half an hour and it will really help. Artists do immediately have copyright rights in things that they create right away without doing anything else. And then there's a process of registering them if you then want to enforce them. So the answer is yes, the work that we were doing was based on Matt's copyrights. He had not registered them at the time that we became involved. So literally, I think we agreed to represent him, I think on August 29th or 30th of 2017. And on September 2nd, we registered all of his stuff because that was the first key step to the process. And that's an important piece of enforcing copyrights. And then we use those copyrights both in the Alex Jones case and in all, I think everything else that's mentioned in the film was specifically copyright focused. We've done some other kind of trade dress type things as well, but for the most part, it's been copyright focused.
Right. So for Arthur and Giorgio, has Matt's experience served as a wake-up call for the artists and animators and like your friends in the community?
I mean, like I said before, I mean, I think Matt is kind of unique in his experience, for better or worse. So, but I will say, like, probably one of the biggest, most vocal supporters of the film have been the artist community, because I think unless you've created something and put it out there, I mean, I personally have some tangential appreciation for it. Most directly, just the fact that our film was like one of the most pirated films of the year. So it's like, that feels weird. It feels weird. It feels like you can see people stealing the thing you worked on for 2 years, and it hurts. And like, I was a musician for 10, I still am, I guess, but like I was a working musician for all of my 20s, and like really rode that wave between the Napster era into the streaming era. And your relationship to your own intellectual property really, like, especially in music at that time, just got completely decimated. And it really forced you to like think about what the value of your work was. So I think even though Matt's experience is very unique, I think it really brings into focus how artists engage in a world of like mass duplication and replication. And what does it mean to be a creator in this kind of world?
I mean, Matt's issue is also kind of, any artist working now has to be on the internet. I mean, everyone has to treat themselves essentially as a brand. And so that moment that I was talking about where Matt and I were trying to figure out a cartoon together, I witnessed very clearly that a lot of people assumed that because Matt had drawn Pepe the Frog, that he himself might have been a member of the alt-right, that he himself might have been a neo-Nazi because of the association with the character. And that was something that, anyone who's on social media now just has to be aware of, that because of this kind of gig economy we're all living in, you have to use social media for your hustle, but it also makes you susceptible to all of these other things. And you have to, your work is tied to who you are as a person in a way it's never been before historically.
And then, I mean, Disney is sort of famous for having these platoons of lawyers going after copyright infringement around the world. But basically, even if you get some pro bono legal advice, isn't it? Louis, I guess I'm asking, I guess the artists are really on their own in a way to be policing the net themselves. I mean,
the unfortunate answer is yes. And there are definitely things that you can do to make it easier, to make sure that you can enforce your rights later. One of the things is if you're going to put something out there that you think has a chance of being copied, right? That somebody might want to rip off for whatever reason, if it's something really easy to mass print and sell or something, or if you're about to put a movie out there, it's really worth it to register your copyright, because if you do that in advance of the other person copying it, then one of the things you can get is your own attorney's fees from somebody who copies it. And it's a lot easier to get lawyers to represent you, that are when they can recover their fees if you've already done the registration. So that's a good step. But I mean, look, I would never say that it's fair out there. It's unfortunate. The big companies that have the ability to get a lot of lawyers to really do the enforcement work are going to be better at the enforcement work, and an artist really do have to kind of do your best to understand what your rights are, register things if you think they're going to be copied, and then keep an eye out and make sure that if something is out there, if someone is out there copying your work, contact a lawyer and see what you can do, either through pro bono help like volunteer lawyers organizations, or somebody who might be able to recover their fees or otherwise in another format.
Luke from the audience asks, to what extent, if any, do you think, excuse me, content moderators on sites like 4chan, Reddit, etc., should be involved in moderating derivative works and speech?
Do you want me to take a crack at this? I'm kind of curious to hear what Giorgio and Arthur think too, but I suspect I'm predicting by the phrasing of to what extent, if any, which is like totally a lawyer question, that Luke is on sort of the legal side of this, which is awesome. And so I'll answer from sort of the lawyer perspective. I mean, I think that there are definitely a whole host of regulations about what content moderators must do, what they can do, and then beyond that, there's the kind of what should they do. Look, I think we are moving into an era in which there's a greater realization that hateful speech has real consequences, and that's what we're seeing with finally Twitter beginning to do more meaningful crackdowns on incitement and hateful speech. Finally, Facebook starting to do more bans, right? The Amazon refusing to host Parler, right? Those kinds of things where I think as the culture and therefore the companies that are sort of have a lot of resources begin to appreciate that and are pushed that way by their customers and by political forces, that we will see more of a push toward content moderation. Right now, at the federal level at least, the laws on content moderation are lax. There's not a lot of responsibility to do anything. Doesn't have to be that way. We could see that change, and I think there is some political will for that to change. But right now, we're kind of trusting in these companies to do the right thing. I think we could see more regulation for sure that would really force everybody to do the right thing.
Kind of more globally, I think it's worth pointing out in this kind of question, especially with this audience, like you see a lot of, the problem is that there kind of exists two operators, right? There's the general public who wants to feel like they can say whatever they want on social media with limited repercussions. But then there's also the kind of professional class of hucksters and snake oil salesmen who really benefit off of what social media has bestowed upon them, right? Like if you imagine 20 years ago, if you were a huckster, you'd have to like go out and hand out pamphlets and like open up a church of some kind and like really create a flock of people to sell your garbage. But then social media comes in and like just delivers you all of the pliant minds of easily, mutable people. And so much so that they put hashtags in their own profiles and tell you like, please steal money from me, right? And so that's why the huckster class really tries to wrap this issue of content moderation in a an issue of First Amendment rights, which of course is a completely bad faith take on it, right? Like, these are private companies that can do whatever they want with their platforms. That has nothing to do with First Amendment, but they have to pretend as if it's a threat to them, because in some sense it is. It is an existential threat to their way of making money. Like, you saw when Alex Jones got deplatformed, he went all the way to Congress and created this big hoopla because, like, it cost him millions of dollars because it was so easy to sell weird supplements to random people on social media, because social media makes it so easy to find those people.
Yeah.
And I will say that 4chan, though, 4chan builds into a certain, like they built in plausible deniability. When you go into 4chan, there's a little pop-up that says, like, if you come here, everything here is a joke. And if you think that's otherwise, you're a fool. Like, that's something that 4chan sort of specifically does. And believe it or not, 4chan does have moderators, and they did that to combat child pornography. 4chan is something that is something that it's a experiment that started out as sort of this, like, anything goes experiment. And we've seen now, because we've observed it for basically almost 20 years, that any of these places that are kind of like free-for-alls all collapse under the weight of their own antisocial kind of issues. And so 4chan, believe it or not, does have some moderation, but the places like 8chan will collapse just because they don't have any sort of guardrails on the usership, and things go terribly wrong, as we've seen over and over and over again.
I thought it was interesting when I was preparing for this to see that the creator of 4chan eventually stepped down. He was finding it kind of so vile, but not vile enough to close. So he's still making money.
Well, he sold it. He sold it. Yeah. But no, you're right. I mean, yeah, what?
He could have shut it down. Yeah.
Yeah, he could have shut it down if he
Oh
found
yeah, for sure. No, both the creators of 4chan and 8chan have moved on to disavow the platforms. I mean, it's interesting to point out.
And it's also interesting to point out that the creator of 4chan is now working at Google at an undisclosed job that no one will talk about what he does.
Yeah, Google won't officially say what he does.
Fantastic. There's a question from Justin M. I guess it's for Lewis. Did any of the litigation reach the merits on fair use? If so, how did that go?
Yeah, so the case that decided fair use was the Alex Jones InfoWars case. And the movie does a terrific job, I think, of giving the theme of that case overall. The point at which the point just before that call from me to Matt explaining that InfoWars has given up was the summary judgment hearing. InfoWars had indeed moved for summary judgment of fair use. And we opposed that motion. For their argument was that there had been this transformative use of Pepe in the poster, and they made two arguments. They made that argument that it was this transformative use, that he was being used in a political speech, free speech kind of way, and they made the argument that Pepe was memeified. Waving at the kids coming on. That Pepe had been memeified. He had become essentially public domain because he was a meme. And we prevailed on both those. The court rightly, we think, rejected both those arguments. That was really the trigger. Once that happened, it was very clear that we're going to go to trial. And it was very clear that if we got to cross-examine Alex Jones on the stand, it was going to be bad for him and we would win pretty soundly in front of a jury. So that's when they caved.
So there was another question related to this from the Bar Association, that InfoWars also discusses the market impact in a kind of crude economic argument that increases in popularity regardless of by whom it's a benefit, not a harm. And they were wondering how you overcame that argument.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting idea because definitely, I deposed Alex Jones for a day. We were fighting with their folks for a year, basically. And they had this idea that putting Pepe on one of their posters, on an InfoWars poster, was only good for Pepe. And how could this possibly hurt Matt? How could this be a bad thing, right? This is upping the profile of his unimportant character in their view. That was their idea. There was no economic harm. In fact, there was a benefit in their view. Our response to that was, look, number one, it's just wrong, right? That when you associate yourself with Alex Jones and InfoWars, you're actually at minimum alienating 50 to 60% of your potential market, if not a whole lot more. So just as a pure economics matter, it's wrong. But it's also wrong as a matter of artistic control, right? Copyright law doesn't say that artists have to give away, have to use their creations in a way that make the most money. It says that artists have the ability to control who can copy their creations and who can't. And that it was totally fine for Matt to say, I don't want to be associated with these hateful ideas, and to enforce his copyright in that way. So we made both arguments. Both of those, I think, were well received, and so the arguments that there was not going to be an aspect of the trial. We were successfully able to exclude as an aspect of the trial this idea that there was no economic harm. So but it was an interesting idea, one that kind of, I think, only really makes sense if you have a sort of a skewed view of the economics of this and are really focused on just dollars and not on artistic integrity.
And to
Well, it's
reinforce,
also, Matt sort of, states in the film that he comes from this place of if people want to make use of it, he's behind that, because he is not mercenary by nature.
yeah.
And so another question which the Bar Association asked, why did that not qualify as copyright abandonment? If you could sort of explain that, because it's on the face of it, it sounds a little bit like copyright abandonment, but.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. Let me first say that characterization of Matt is totally right. I mean, what the first thing that we did, and it's talked about in the movie, is we went after this Islamophobic book, The Adventures of Pepe and Pede, and we were able to recover literally all of the profits that book made. But Matt didn't want the money, right? Because he wasn't in this and hasn't ever been in it for the money. And so we actually made, as a condition of the settlement agreement, that the profits would not be given to Matt, but as a condition of the settlement agreement, they'd be turned over to the Council on American Islamic Relations, the CARE Foundation, which is great because it's not about the money; it's about doing the right thing. So that was that characterization is right. In terms of him wanting people to use this, so this is one of these sort of nerdy intellectual property law things, but in copyright, you're allowed to selectively enforce your copyright. You're allowed to not enforce it for a while and then choose to enforce it later. You're allowed to enforce it against people you don't like and not enforce it against others. It's okay. That's all part of the artistic integrity thing. It's all wrapped up in that. So to abandon your copyright, you have to make a very clear statement that is relied on, that somebody else is allowed to use it. And it's interesting, this is the best thing that Alex Jones came up with was this wacky article where Matt gave a joke interview and I know Arthur knows all about it, a joke interview where he was he had taken a pamphlet about home births and doulas and just copied the answers from that pamphlet into responses from a reporter about what he thought about Pepe. So it was all about bringing Pepe into being into the world, and it was this wild interview.
It was 4chan can birth their own Pepes, like
yes,
yeah.
And so Alex Jones, his lawyers found that article, didn't get the joke, and decided that they were going to rely on that to say that Alex Jones had read that and he used it as his basis for using Pepe. And that's why the deposition of him was kind of funny. And then that was going to be a great part of the cross-examination at trial. If we got there, he was going to have to say that he relied on a fake doula joke article as his basis, to meet this very high standard of reliance on abandonment. So
I will say though, to piggyback on that, just because we've been doing a lot of Q&As with Fury, and he's very unpredictable in the Q&A setting. And we did this Q&A recently, and he'd been emailing with a channeler from Sedona who had seen the movie and felt as though she was compelled to reach out to him because some celestial force had told her to email Matt. And so during the Q&A, Matt started referring to Giorgio and I as his guardian angels and all this stuff. And he was reading verbatim from his correspondence with his channeler during the Q&A just to kind of give us a hard time. But no one knew what was going on except him.
And also, I will say back to the question about like the specious response that Alex Jones like improved the value of Pepe. I will say there is a reason why we had to self-release the film. It's not on Netflix,
Right?
So like,
Right.
Very true.
Well, I can sympathize, Arthur, because I had read the interview he gave, and then had to defend him in his deposition, where he would very often. I love the part that you captured in the film where he's asked about whether he had lived this kind of like carefree lifestyle, and his answer is, "Oh, I still live that lifestyle." Right? That was made for a great part of the film, and totally had me biting my nails throughout the deposition for exactly.
Well, as part of what makes it so moving, though, is that he's clearly a sort of a sweet guy. And, you know, he just is really trying to be kind in the world. And so you really sometimes just kind of really feel for him, that these malign forces, and he's kind of he's just making his art, you know, and he's got his lovely family, and he just doesn't seem to have, you know, those defenses in place to deal with the kind of dreadful stuff that's coming his way. But nonetheless, he just keeps, you know, he keeps going on. But I found that very moving, you know, that he didn't want to get into it, but then once he did, he's just going forward.
I think
quietly,
that's what made
you know,
him
in his own way.
I think it's what made him a compelling protagonist for the film, because I think what Arthur and I hoped was that people would see a bit of themselves in Matt. That in the same way Matt felt like he lost his work, and that like getting up off the proverbial couch and like reclaiming his work was a kind of reclaiming himself and reclaiming his reality, was something that I think a lot of Americans were grappling with and are grappling with, like that reality as they understood it had been taken away from them, and that they couldn't sit on the sidelines anymore.
Right. Savannah H from the audience asks, we're seeing a lot of pop-ups now on social media that identify when materials might be false or misleading. Is this enough? Is this a label that the non-normies will take as a badge of honor?
Yeah, I think, yeah, that I assume she's referring to before Trump was booted off of Twitter. They would just do these really absurd little warnings on his. Yeah, it's like standing in front of a tidal wave, like holding up your hands. You know, it's.
But it speaks to these social media networks believing that terms and conditions are going to be the sort of way out of this.
Right.
You know, it's like by putting this gray box of like legalese that feels like sort of perfunctory copy, you know, that can be ignored in the same way like the side effects of a Lipitor ad or whatever these things might be are. You know, I mean, all of these platforms have terms and conditions, and a lot of this stuff is in violation of it. It's just not enforced in any sort of way. And yeah, I don't know how it gets enforced to a certain degree, but yeah, I think often those sort of conspiratorial sort of citations become a badge of honor for people.
But also, I think it's something we need to understand is that, and I think I would hope that the Capitol riots are very clear evidence of that. It's the understanding that for a lot of Americans, and I assume a lot of people around the world, there is an issue now that people are having a very difficult time distinguishing between their virtual selves and their real life selves. And for, I think COVID supercharged the problem because it just heightened the alienation. And like you saw come to life, a real life manifestation of this digital world at the Capitol riots. You saw people alongside real evil, like real militia members trying to do real harm. You saw standing alongside those people, just like other people just kind of wandering around, like they just woken from a dream, or like still kind of sleepwalking, trying to figure out where the hell they are, but also kind of live streaming and posting as if they have like no, like completely dissociative moment. And, you know, warnings like that are not going to help the problem. And I think we just have to figure out like how social media and this reality that like human beings so certain human beings have a hard time distinguishing between the virtual and the real. Like, how do those things coexist moving forward?
That leads right to this question from Nat H that he says, Lawrence Lessig has written about remix culture, about how the internet has changed the way we think about traditional copyright. Do you believe, as Lessig does, that copyright law should be reformed in some way to respond to this new paradigm?
So, the short answer from my perspective is, of course, but I am actually not sure that it's all that wildly new that we need to continue to update and change and reform aspects of our law to keep up with new social, technological, and sort of human trends. So yes, of course, we need to be thinking about what our copyright law ought to look like in this very different world. I think it's hilarious that the thing that is used by copyright owners and artists to enforce their rights is called the Digital Millennium Copyright Act. And you have to be sort of a certain age to like even remember the idea of like, oh, the millennium, the digital millennium, it's coming, right? This is a thing from like the 90s. And I mean, the 90s, that's our latest and greatest enforcement of artistic rights. Of course, we need to keep up with these things. Now, it's hard, right? Because then you have to involve politics and you involve the sort of the slow movement of federal changes in law, and judges are doing their best to try to keep up with technology and changes in the way that people interact using the old laws. But of course, these things need to be continually be rethought as technology and as people get more sophisticated.
Yeah, and I mean, added to that is the whole the deep fakes and how sophisticated misinformation, disinformation has become, which just to what Giorgio was talking about, people kind of wandering around. I mean, it really is difficult. It really is difficult to distinguish between the real and the fake.
Yeah, I think
and it's only going to get worse.
Well, in the deepfakes area in particular, that's actually a place where I think for other reasons, the law at the state level actually is doing a decent job of at least paying attention to the problem and figuring it out. I think candidly, it's largely the result of political ads, right? That then get the attention of people in political positions, realizing this is actually a problem and maybe we should do something about it more broadly. But New York actually just passed an incredible deepfakes law that does very good things for non-consensual pornography and preventing that, and that criminalizes a whole host of problematic behaviors, and also creates this really interesting set of artist rights after death for people who are primarily engaged in either film or stage acting, which is it's a big deal, right? Because up until then, it really actually wasn't that much of a problem to try to take an old compilation video and make somebody say something that they couldn't say now. And now there are some rights. So I think they're actually, interestingly enough, that's a place where there is a lot of thought about what the law ought to be. It's happening mostly at the state level. So I will confess, I don't know what's going on in New Mexico there, but I hope that there is continually an effort to look at this, because that's where we're going to get some good traction and some good thought about how to deal with these changes, at least in a timely way. It's going to have to be sort of state by state for now.
Can I ask the filmmakers, please, to explain to me what Pepe money is? I just kind of got lost there.
This may take
Arthur, you want to take a crack at it? Or I can go, whatever.
Well, I mean, so there was always this joke that memes have their own economy, that memes are worth something. And so as people would make memes, they would sort of talk about a meme the joke was particularly good or particularly biting as being rare. And people would talk about that as sort of an economy of rareness or scarcity. And that was something that happened before crypto entered into the situation. And so the joke about the meme economy was going anyway. Then when Bitcoin became a very popular thing several years ago, people noticed that there was no sort of visual representation of what a Bitcoin was. And therefore it made it like an abstract thing even more abstract. It made the blockchain, which was essentially just a string of numbers, that much more invisible. And so people were like, well, why not take this random meme economy and merge this idea with the Bitcoin economy and give crypto something visual to look at? The Pepe Cash also plays into Pokemon trading, which is a digital trading card that is very popular amongst a lot of these guys when they were younger, like when they were teenagers or in junior high, they would use Pokemon trading cards, and here they are now in their 20s and they're trading digital trading cards for some sort of value. So I understand it's a really confusing thing, but yes, so there's two different things. There's the rare Pepes you buy, there's Pepe Cash, and then there's Bitcoin. So
Right.
you use Bitcoin to buy Pepe Cash, you use Pepe Cash to buy these individual JPEGs.
But I don't know, there is
specific thing.
But for the art,
Somebody ended up with a Lamborghini.
yeah. Well,
All right,
for the artistic,
all right, we're getting there. We're getting there. I promise
for the
you.
artistic community out there, I think there is an interesting project there. In that, like in the rise of digital artwork, of course, there's an IP question here too. Is like, how do you own a digital piece of artwork that can just by its virtue be copied and pasted and repeated? Like, how do you own a JPEG? Is actually kind of an interesting concept in a world where people actually do pay for, like, I would pay Arthur $100 to create like an avatar for me on my gaming platform site for my profile. Or just like straight up digital artwork for your background on your computer or whatever. There are people in the art world, like, so I have a friend, Mary Ellen Carroll, who's a conceptual artist in New York, who created an blockchain-based art ownership program that would benefit nonprofits who were working for asylum seekers at the border. And they're using blockchain, for example. They got a bunch of famous artists to donate smaller pieces, and then they sold them using the blockchain and ensured that basically in the future retrading of the artwork, that money would be, that those trades would all happen in the blockchain, and that the money would be sent back to the nonprofits. So it is a really interesting way that impacts not just digital art, but how artists can maybe participate in the future, in their future potential earnings, right? That's often cut out from them and is just purely part of the speculative, like, wealthy art ownership market.
But I will also say that, I mean, it's kind of interesting to talk about this given this GameStop moment that's happening right now. Like, all of these sort of cryptocurrency traders are early to this idea that society is just catching up to, that the economy we're living in right now no longer needs laborers, it only needs consumers. That the attention economy is our new economy, whether we like it or not, and the value attached to that attention is worth something. We're trying to figure out what it is. And so a lot of these guys, I mean, they're currency trolls, they're economic trolls. And this is, Pepe has been a tool for trolling. So this is another example of that. It is sort of it's something to be aware of moving forward as things are beginning to change.
So do you guys, Giorgio and Arthur, are you working on some more stuff together, or you both are off on your own on other projects?
No, yeah, we're collaborating. Just, definitely in a ideation moment on different projects.
Yeah, this movie, it was a real like labor of love, and we made it independently, we released it independently. So, I think we're both kind of like now taking a step back and thinking about kind of what the next project is going to be, but we aren't sure what it is yet.
Right. Well, to the audience, we're about to wrap up. So if there's any other questions, send them in. Otherwise, we're going to say thank you so much to everybody for participating. Some fabulous questions that were sent in. And Giorgio and Louis and Arthur for giving us your time, and Brianna. And that's been incredibly informative and helpful. And I'd like to close by saying that CCA and the New Mexico Museum for the Arts, like all arts institutions, you have any loose change in your pockets, donations are gratefully accepted.
Pepe Cash also accepted.
Here. And filmmakers. So thank you all very, very much. This has really been a fantastic evening. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for having
Thank
us.
you. Yeah.
Thank you.
And if you're an Oscar voter, next week is Oscar voting season. So
All right.
There we go. Hustle the hustle.
bye. Thank you guys so much.
Bye.